First of all, I want to thank you so much for spending the next few hours of your Saturday afternoon with us today. I do hope that you will go away with a lot more information that you came with, as well as access to much more information that we're more than happy to share with you. Once we complete this DVD, the back section of the DVD will be all the documents that I'm going to show little bits of today, just so it will be able to give you the supporting documentation of what I'm going to mention. But before I get started, I really would like to thank Debbie, because without her, this day would not have happened. It was a matter of Debbie contacting me and saying, Bev, people have to hear what you have to say. I want to do something about it. And that's all it takes is intention. And look at what's happened today, how many people have come out. So thank you so much, Debbie. Okay, I'm going to give you a little bit about my background, just so you know who I am and why I'm here talking about this stuff with you today. And then I'll get started on the actual presentation. My step into politics happened many years ago. I actually come from Ottawa. I was in the scientific industry for a number of years, selling to different laboratories, manufacturers, and government departments while the Mulroney government was in power. So I got to see a lot firsthand. Over the years, I went through different scientific companies and eventually owned my own scientific company. So I had some dealings directly with the supplier's bidding process with the federal government. So I was able to obtain booklets on a weekly basis on who won the contracts, what were they for, how much it was for, etc. And that piqued my interest. Even though I was busy doing business every day, it also piqued my interest because there certainly seemed to be a lot of awards and contracts given to one particular area, and that concerned me. In 1991, the Mulroney government cut back on research and development significantly in Ottawa. And sadly, little companies like myself could no longer compete against the multi-billion-dollar European and American companies. So I closed my company down and came out west to write a book called The Deals That Were Made, and everything that I was able to encounter while dealing with the Mulroney government. I did write the book. I never got it published. It was more of a release and what have you. But once I came out to the Kootenays, I quickly realized that many people out west had no idea what was going on in Ottawa. So I began to bring speakers out west. The first two speakers I brought were Mel Hertig, and after him I brought Glenn Keeley and Shelley-Ann Clark. For those of you, Mel Hertig was the co-founder and founder of the Council of Canadians, as well as the leader of the National Party of Canada. Glenn Keeley had done a lot of business with the Mulroney government and came out and did a Western tour exposing the corruption within the Mulroney government with cabinet ministers and kickbacks, etc. Shelley-Ann Clark was brought out here so she could expose the free trade agreement. She was part of the negotiation team under Derek Burney and Jermaine Denis. And Shelley-Ann has an excellent DVD that we also have available, not with us today, but if you are interested, please ask and we'll make sure that you get a copy. Shelley-Ann was part of the negotiation team. She saw a lot of corruption happening during the negotiations. Basically the fact that the U.S. had a God password to be able to access our computers through the negotiations, and were able to very quickly find out where everybody stood. They had to convince all the different provinces to come on board. So what they did through this password was able to determine all of the negotiations that were happening between the provincial premiers and the federal government. So if one province insisted on having a certain percentage back or access to a bigger market or what have you, that's what they would ensure that that premier got so that he would come on board. And they had different briefing books for each and every premier. So I brought Shelley-Ann out and I brought Mel Hertig out west as soon as he had written the book called Betrayal of Canada. Mel decided to start up a federal political party in 1993, and I was one of his first candidates for a federal candidate. So that was my first federal election. After the federal election, I was asked to remain political because people found that I certainly was trying to accumulate a lot of information and be able to share it with people. So I began to do a U.S. speaking tour. I went down to the U.S. and did 7 different states. I ended up being able to be a guest and a host on a number of different radio shows throughout the U.S. and Canada. I came back and ran in the 1993 federal election. By the time 1997 came along, I had been more of a researcher, a writer, a speaker. I ended up doing a cross-western provincial tour right to the tip of Manitoba and Ontario border. When I came back, the National Party, sadly, was no longer surviving. So in 1997, it was Paul Hellyer, who originally was the first and youngest defense minister in Canada under the Liberal government. And Paul Hellyer had decided at this point that we really needed to continue the struggle and the fight against NAFTA and the trade agreements, because it is these trade agreements that have got us into the mess that we're in today. So I brought Paul Hellyer out west as well, and when I heard him speak, I thought, okay, we definitely need to do something about this. So in 1997, the Canadian Action Party of Canada started up. Again, I was one of their first candidates, and I've been very pleased to represent CAP in the last 4 federal elections. 97 and 2000, again in the Kootenays, and then 2004, 2005, 6 in the Prince George Caribou riding. I went from member to candidate to vice president, and now I'm fortunate enough to be the president of the party. So what I've done today is I've put together a PowerPoint presentation, because I think it's so crucial to know a bit of the history, who's involved in all of this. I do name names. I name their particular positions of power, because once you understand who these people are, and once you understand the positions that they play in this, you will quickly understand that this is not an insurmountable giant to try and defeat, that we don't have a chance, that they're going to get their way. Absolutely not. As a matter of fact, what you'll quickly learn is we're dealing with about 158 businessmen, 8 politicians, and 1 very, very busy person that goes back and forth between the U.S. and Canada. And I'll share with you very shortly who that happens to be. So I'll get started right now. Before Stephen Harper became Prime Minister, he went off to the Bilderberg meeting in Versailles, France in 2003. For those of you who don't know who the Bilderbergs are, they include European royalty, national leaders, political power brokers, and heads of the world's biggest companies. They have the uncanny ability to predict who will be the next leaders. There's been Bilderberg meetings in both Ottawa and Toronto in the past. Some members who have attended before, Stéphane Dion has attended, Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin, and of course Stephen Harper in 2003. Stephen Harper returned to Canada and began to publicly discuss merging the Conservative and Reform/Alliance Party together under a new Conservative Party. This occurred publicly the week after he came back from this meeting. So, in January of 2006, Stephen Harper then became Canada's newest Conservative Prime Minister. After 13 years of Liberal rule, the old new Conservatives were back in the seat of power. A new political base of power filled with former Mulroney members and Reform Alliance members who now had no idea who was in control. The more things change, the more they remain the same, and you'll see what I mean. Broken promises. Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper with former Conservative Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. The old and new joined forces. Many of us, when we fought NAFTA in the 1993 election, the main reason the Liberal government came back to power in 1993 was over the NAFTA agreement. We were lied to. We were told that it was going to be negotiated, that we were going to ensure that water was no longer a part of NAFTA. And the Liberals promised us that they would renegotiate NAFTA if they got back into power. Well, as you know, from 88 to 93, Canadians really woke up to Brian Mulroney's part in all of this. And he was able to push over his power base to Kim Campbell, right before the Conservatives were defeated by the Canadian people from 176 seats in Parliament down to 2. And the Liberals regained power. Now, in order to merge the 3 countries together, these political players who wanted to see the merging of the 3 countries together had to then have their business counterparts. And this is where Tom D'Aquino comes in. Tom D'Aquino is the President and Chief Executive of the Canadian Council of Chief Executive Officers, or CCCE. And I'm going to read what it says. Founded in 1976, the CCCE is strongly committed to enhancing Canadian competitiveness within a more secure and prosperous North America. The Council was the private sector leader in the development and promotion of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement in the 80s and the subsequent trilateral North American Free Trade Agreement. A truer paragraph was never spoken. They were indeed responsible for the development and promotion of both the free trade and NAFTA. But what they needed was they needed political people in Ottawa to be able to push their corporate agenda. In 2003, and remember that date, it's going to become important a bit too. In 2003, the Council launched its North American Security and Prosperity Initiative, which has been credited with helping to establish the agenda for the subsequent Security and Prosperity Partnership of North America. So this was back in 2003, and we only began to hear about the SPP and the negotiations between Paul Martin at the time and Bush and Vicente Fox in Waco, Texas in 2005. So they had already been working on establishing this agenda back in 2003. The Conservatives in Ottawa in the 1980s. So the corporate elite pride themselves on being responsible for bringing Canada into both the free trade under Conservative Prime Minister Brian Mulroney in 1988. Their $52 million slush fund assisted Mulroney during the federal election to persuade Canadians that free trade with the USA would be good for all of us. That's how much the corporate players in 1988 donated to the Mulroney government. So what happened was the free trade agreement became the election issue of 1988. So when Brian Mulroney was put into power again in 1988, he said, oh, well, the first rule of business is I'm going to pass this into the free trade agreement. He had a lot of help. We had continuous bombardment of television commercials, of brochures, of newsletters, etc., telling us how great the free trade agreement with the U.S. was going to be for us. Their corporate plan. Under the Mulroney government, these corporate elite launched their plan for the North American integration through the groundwork of the free trade agreements. In NAFTA, the National Treatment Clause in NAFTA gave corporations the unrestricted right to invest in Canada without conditions and without limits. So we have now lost the right to say that only the foreign investment that's beneficial to Canada is welcome. Because what happened before is if a company wanted to invest in Canada, they would have to hire Canadians, or they would have to buy our products, or they would have to use our equipment. This doesn't occur anymore under the National Treatment Clause in NAFTA. NAFTA is also worse than the Free Trade Agreement because of Chapter 11. And Chapter 11 allows both American and Mexican companies the right to sue us if any of our governments at federal, provincial, or municipal level passes or amends a law that affects their profits or future profits. Chapter 11 has been so damaging to us. It has forced us to put additives in the gasoline that we once had made illegal. It actually sued us and made us change our legislation to suit it. As a matter of fact, another NAFTA lawsuit was just bombarded against Canada last week from Nova Scotia, where this company now feels that Canada's regulations and standards are standing in the way of their potential profit. So we are now being sued under NAFTA again. Since NAFTA, Canada has lost over 13,000 corporations to foreign takeovers. 35% of Canada's top 500 companies are now foreign-controlled, and foreign ownership is now over 50% in 35 different industries. And we're talking resource industry, financial industry, banking industry. So Mulroney signed Canada into NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, standing there beside George Bush Sr. Interestingly enough, Michael Wilson in front of him. Michael Wilson was his finance minister at the time, and also foreign affairs minister at one point. Very influential in both trade agreements, both the free trade and NAFTA, as well as now the SPP agreement, because Michael Wilson is now our Canadian ambassador to the USA, thanks to Brian Mulroney. So, the North American Economic and Security Community by 2010. The Canadian Council of Chief Executives have said that North American economic integration is now well advanced and irreversible. And in the face of global terrorism, the economic and physical security of the continent has become indivisible. This is out of a report that they did called New Frontiers. And what they want to see is they want to see a total North American economic and security community by 2010. That is only 2 years away. The CCCE is made up of only 150 Canadian Chief Executive Officers. Only 150 of these businessmen. Lots. pages worth. There's hundreds of them in the U.S. Okay, what corporations do these CEOs represent in Canada? Well, Air Canada, BC Hydro, TELUS, CanWest Global, which is interesting because CanWest Global is very, very much behind Stephen Harper, both in his leadership campaign they donated to, as well as the entire Conservative Party. You will see CanWest continuously putting out polls convincing you that the Conservatives could possibly win a majority government this time. And Canada and Enbridge, which are very large oil and gas companies in Alberta, SNC-Lavalin, military, CIBC, Royal Bank, Canfor Corporation, Alcan, Bechtel, Barrick Gold, Bell Canada Enterprises, Bombardier, CAE, CP Rail, CN Rail, DuPont, Imperial Oil, Petro-Canada, Power Corporation, Pratt & Whitney, Raytheon, Shell, Terrason, TransAlta, and TransCanada Corporation. Now those are only some of the 150. But you can see the collective power of it, both in banking, energy, communications, etc. Okay. Under the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, these CEOs want complete economic, resource, and military integration with the USA by 2010. Members of these large businesses are from the oil and gas sectors, defense, media, aerospace, banks, and our resource industries. None of these members are elected. None of them. Nor are they accountable to you, the Canadian citizen, yet. We're going to hold them to account. Canadian Council of Chief Executives return to their trade agenda. The Canadian parliamentary ministers who are involved in furthering the North American agenda under the Security and Prosperity Partnership are, under the Liberal Party, it was Paul Martin, John Manley, who's of course been very active with the Harper Government lately over the Afghanistan issue, Anne McClellan, Pierre Pettigrew, and David Emerson. Before and now after the election, we've switched him over to the Conservative side because he just walked across the floor as soon as he was elected as a Liberal. So, under the Conservative Party, we have Stephen Harper, Peter MacKay, Stockwell Day, Gordon O'Connor, Dave Emerson, and Maxime Bernier. They are Foreign Affairs, Defense, Minister of Trade, Public Safety, International Trade, and of course Stephen Harper. The CEO political puppets. With companies like Power Corporation, it does not matter to these big business elite what party gets into power, as long as their spokesman does. So these CEOs have donated heavily to Brian Mulroney, Paul Martin, and now Stephen Harper. Some of the company CEOs, such as Paul Desmarais from Power Corp, donate to both parties to ensure compliance with the business agenda once their party controls Parliament. So it does not matter if you put in Liberals, it does not matter if you put in Conservatives. That is what Canada is facing nowadays. If we have members in both the mainstream parties who are using their political power in Ottawa to further merge us into a North American Union. Their new man in Ottawa is Stephen Harper. After merging the Alliance Party with the Conservative Party, Harper and his senior advisor, Brian Mulroney, made plans to integrate Canada and the USA. Brian Mulroney acted as Stephen Harper's senior advisor in the 2004 federal election. Mulroney campaigned with Harper and escorted him through Quebec and the Maritime provinces. Many of us assume that we actually got rid of Mulroney back in 1992. Wait till I tell you how much he's still involved. This is Joe Clark. He's slamming Harper. He's calling him dangerous. What I've done is I've taken the articles, but there's sections of it that I found quite important. So this is why I put sections of it, but then on the DVD, if you're interested in getting it afterwards, we'll have the complete documents to back it up. Okay? So what I know of Stephen Harper's second paragraph, what I know of Stephen Harper and what I know of Paul Martin, I have to believe that Paul Martin would be less dangerous to our country. Now this is Joe Clark, a former Prime Minister of the Conservative Party, saying this about Conservative Stephen Harper. I think there's a very dismal choice for Canadians right now. I think both so-called national parties have let the public down. His disillusionment with the United Conservative Party under Harper is in stark contrast to the view of another former Tory Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, who gave Mr. Harper his full support for the first time on the weekend and portrayed the new party as a middle-of-the-road option. Yeah, right. This is the kind of party Stephen Harper's leading, a moderate, successful Conservative party, he said at a fundraiser in Moncton. He told a group of 600 people that Mr. Harper's the right person to take the Conservatives back to power. This was planned for some time. But unlike Mr. Clark, he distanced himself from the new party and accused Mr. Harper of stifling progressive elements of the political right. Mr. Mulroney has worked actively behind the scenes to bring the Canadian Alliance of Progressive Conservatives together. That was his role. When he got kicked out in '92, he never stopped being political. You have to understand, this man is a businessman. So after he left politics, he went back to his Ogilvy Renault, his law firm, and he became a board of directors for over a dozen different major CEO corporations, such as Bechtel, Barrick Gold, Archer Daniel Midland, lots of American companies Mulroney became a board of directors for. Mulroney-Harper alliance is bad news for Canada's workers. Presidential candidate John Kerry in the last presidential election tried to warn Canadians about the Mulroney-Harper connection. Brian Mulroney is back, and it's bad news for Canadian workers. If any reminder was needed, apart from his close association with leader Stephen Harper, it came last week with the reporting of a Mulroney-related union-busting operations in the U.S. One of the companies that Mulroney is a big director for is Quebecor, and Mulroney has emerged as one of Harper's most important advisors in the June 28 Canadian election campaign. He's also chairman of Quebecor World of Montreal, one of the largest commercial print media services companies anywhere. So Quebecor was just blasted by U.S. presidential candidate John Kerry for gross interference with American employees who wanted to join a union. So Senator John Kerry at the bottom. The former Canadian Prime Minister has been keeping a low profile during the Canadian election, mainly because of the memories of his 84 to 93 government are still so raw in voters' minds that his influence would be seen as a liability if citizens knew how close the two men have become. Would you really have supported Stephen Harper had you known that Brian Mulroney was behind him for this entire time? Chances are you may not. Conservative Party is to call for closer ties to the USA. Conservative Party is expected to propose that Canada and the US deepen their ties by moving towards a European-style economic relationship. A version of the Conservative platform, which was to be released Saturday, states that Canada should enhance our NAFTA relationship with the US. It specifies that the two countries should pursue common trading rules, going beyond the tariff elimination under the Free Trade Agreement. Such measures would essentially prepare for a customs union, a North American trading bloc with the rest of the world. The document goes further, stating that closer ties with Washington should also include enhanced common labor, environmental, and security standards. In order to merge our three countries, they have to merge our standards. They have to merge our regulations and our laws. And that is what's occurring, is instead of the U.S. and Mexico coming up to Canada's standards as far as workers' rights, environmental protection, etc. Sadly, in order for this North American Union agenda to happen, Canada's standards are being reduced to those of the USA and Mexico. A customs union entails a level of economic integration beyond what's involved in the free trade agreement, such as trilateral NAFTA. So Harper was then introduced to the corporate boys by Brian Mulroney. The ex-PM praised Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper, whom he compared favorably to the late Ronald Reagan, and his performance so far, including his efforts to strengthen the Canadian relations with the U.S. Mulroney cited the recent agreement to end the long-standing trade dispute over softwood lumber. Harper understands that an excellent relationship between the Prime Minister of Canada and the President of the United States is first and foremost at all times in Canada's national interest. So he made it his first policy, his first foreign policy, to merge more with the U.S. And then we have Liberal Conservative Dave Emerson. So while in opposition, one of the things the Conservatives were fighting was against floor crossing. If you were elected as an MP for one party, you should not be able to immediately step across the floor, or walk across the floor and pretend to be representing your constituents with another party. So 40 Conservative MPs, just days before the election, supported a private member's bill banning floor crossing without a by-election. But within hours of receiving the election results, Mr. Harper sought out the Liberal Minister David Emerson for a key position in his cabinet. Now, Dave Emerson was the former head of and CEO of Canfor Corporation. Canfor Corporation is one of the corporations that want to see the North American agenda. So they put David Emerson, made him a conservative, and put him in charge of the softwood lumber agreement with the U.S. Well, as I'm sure you know, the softwood lumber agreement was signed. The difficulty is, please tell the people of the North in BC and Ontario and Quebec just how good that softwood lumber agreement has been for those workers. We're now seeing, just in northern BC, over 2,000 people laid off due to mill closures, due to softwood lumber effects. So has it helped Canada? Not at all. They've had a number of mills both closed in Quebec and Ontario. We've had at least 11 mills affected in northern BC. And these people, these workers have been working for Canfor and companies such as Canfor for some of them 28, 33 years for these companies. And now they've been told, sorry, we have no more room for you. You're unemployed. So all of a sudden, these people who have given that many years of their energy and life to these companies have no other jobs to go to. There are no other sector industries available for them to jump into mining or to jump into oil and gas. They are being devastated under the forestry sector. Mulroney USA. Brian Mulroney has continued to represent Canada to the U.S. corporate elite. This is one of the most important slides. Brian Mulroney sits on a dozen boards in corporate offices, including Power Corporation, Quebec World, Blackstone, Barrick Gold, and Archer Daniel Midland. He's a lawyer and lobbyist for Power Corporation, and they set up Hydro-Quebec and Ontario Hydro in a Hong Kong-based Asian group. But in 2003, Brian Mulroney became the only Canadian to sit as an international advisor on the board of the American Council on Foreign Relations. Now, I have collected the Council on Foreign Relations books for at least the last 8 years, and you'll be able to see for yourself, right up to 2002, they needed someone else from Canada who was conservative to fill that position, to be the go-between between American big business under the CFR, Canadian big business under the Canadian Council of Chief Executive Officers. So between 1993 and 2003, they had Barbara McDougall, conservative person, in as that go-between, the liaison. In 2003, they put Brian Mulroney in power. And he is listed, Council on Foreign Relations books. He is the only Canadian, it says right here, Senior Partner Ogilvy Renault, former Prime Minister of Canada. And he sits on the International Advisory Board. What he does on the International Advisory Board is he advises American corporate CEOs on what's happening in Canada. How the trade negotiations are going, how the SPP negotiations are going, how the entire merging integration is going. So Brian Mulroney has never left us. As a matter of fact, if anything, I believe he's continued to sell out of Canada. The CFR is a lobby group for U.S. corporations. The CFR is the same independent organization who helped to draft our Canadian CEO's agenda to integrate Canada into the USA by 2010. One of the Council's latest reports has been building a North American community. And I do have a report at the back in case anyone wants to see it. So he is the corporate go-between between Canada and the U.S. George Bush Sr. had Brian Mulroney to his Camp David, Maryland before he retired. And he was basically commenting on how good of a family friend Brian Mulroney has been to the Bushes for many, many years. Of course, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, thank you, George Bush. We're delighted to be here. The President has pointed out that the strength of Canadian-American relationships is, as you know, a huge and complicated one, and not always an easy one. But it indicates the extent to which neighbors can become friends and mutually assisting partners. Isn't that sweet? We get to mutually assist our partner in the U.S. Harper Mulroney, Till, a test for Tories. People were starting to find out that Brian Mulroney had been helping Harper behind the scenes quite a bit. So this is the kind of news media that started to come out, mostly in Ontario. Controversy surrounding former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney is emerging as the first major test of unity in Prime Minister Stephen Harper's Conservative Party. Because as you know, Brian Mulroney is now under investigation. Though many Conservative partisans are saying that power will keep them united, there's also doubt that Harper's bans on dealings with Mulroney has shaken foundations within the party. When Harper had to decide whether he was going to hold a public inquiry over Brian Mulroney and the Karl-Heinz Schreiber debacle that they were happening, what he had to, 4 years, let me just check here. Harper had to ban his MPs from speaking to Mulroney. He did not want the media or the public to see that they were still working together behind the scenes. So he stopped his MPs from having any dealings with Mulroney. Well, that really upset the apple cart within the Conservative Party, because Brian Mulroney still has a number of his Conservative people within the Harper government. We have Michael Wilson. We have Derek Burney. We have Marjorie Le Breton. There's about 11 to 13 of Mulroneyites in there. Less than 4 years ago, Harper and Mulroney were instrumental in bringing the old Progressive Conservatives and the Canadian Alliance parties together, largely by putting together their differences. People felt the Reform Party in the West started up because of the opposition to the Conservative Party in Ottawa. People of the West felt they were being ignored by Ottawa. No one was paying attention to them. They had their own agenda, it appeared, and the Reform Party got started in opposition. The Reform Party slowly became stronger and started to grow. And the more it grew, the stronger it became, the more of a threat it was to the old-time Conservatives. So what happened then was a few of the Reform MPs crossed the floor and decided to fight Stockwell Day, who was the leader at the time. Thus, the Alliance Party was established. And then they were easily able to merge, after he came back from the Bilderberg meeting, the Alliance and the old-time Conservative and Reform Party all into one party. So basically the Conservatives helped set up an opposition, helped control the opposition, and helped take back that opposition under the Conservative Party. It's not the inquiry that's a problem, it's the idea that Mulroney is someone who should be kept at a distance, that somehow there's a taint. And yes, there is. Mulroney has had a key role. Without him, this never would have happened, the PC Alliance merger. Mulroney cast a long shadow in Harper Government. Mr. Harper has previously been proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with Mr. Mulroney, the former Conservative Prime Minister, declaring him indispensable. At a lavish dinner in Ottawa last year, honouring Mr. Mulroney as Canada's greenest Prime Minister, Mr. Harper credited Mr. Mulroney with having worked behind the scenes to help broker the deal that led to the merger of the Alliance and Progressive Conservative Party. So that was how they did it. They brought it back under the Conservative fold. So Canada's new ambassador to Washington happens to be Michael Wilson. So strong Canada-U.S. relationships are a priority with my government, Harper says. Michael Wilson's in-depth knowledge and experience in the financial sector and in government will make him a strong advocate for Canada in negotiations with our most important bilateral partner. The 68-year-old was finance minister under Brian Mulroney for 7 years. He also served as Prime Minister Brian Mulroney's Minister of Finance from 84 to 91, Minister of Industry, Science and Technology, and Minister for International Trade between 91 and 93. That's when NAFTA was brought in. So as you saw the picture of Michael Wilson sitting there signing us into NAFTA back in 92. Blanchard and others predicted Wilson will be well received in the U.S. Capitol, no kidding, where he has ties to Bush's father and officials from that era. Wilson served in various cabinet posts in the 80s and early 90s under Brian Mulroney, bringing in the hated GST. He also took a lead role in the free trade negotiations. Mulroney helped recruit Wilson. This came out of Toronto Star article. Former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney played a key role in Michael Wilson's appointment as Canada's new ambassador to Washington. Wilson, who was officially announced Thursday as Stephen Harper's nominee for the job, said he began hearing rumors towards the end of the recent election campaign that a new Conservative government might actually tap him for the post. He dismissed the speculation as idle gossip until he had a chance to talk with Mulroney just after the January 23rd voting day. We're just talking about the election, Wilson recalled, and during the course of conversation he said, you know, you might give some thought to the ambassadorial posting because I think you do a great job. So how nice of Brian Mulroney to decide who should be our Canadian ambassador to U.S. The words of former Prime Minister in whose cabinet Wilson served for 9 years got his attention in a way that previous gossip couldn't. Isn't that sweet? So within days of his talk with Mulroney, who has been a close advisor to Harper, and he's been guiding him from the start, Wilson sought out Derek Burney, a former ambassador to the U.S., as also a one-time Mulroney chief of staff. Now, Derek Burney was involved in the free trade negotiations. Shelley Ann Clark worked with Derek Burney. Derek Burney became U.S. ambassador from Canada. So it's all a nice little family they've kept it in. So Wilson was sitting down with Harper. By the end of the meeting, the job was being offered. By February 3rd, so only 3 days after the election, Harper was already talking to Michael Wilson. Harper and Mulroney are known to have spoken regularly during the campaign and about the transition to power. So Mulroney had a whole entire transition team of old Mulroney Conservative people that helped the Harper Conservative government prepare to come into power in Ottawa. So now Michael Wilson wants to fix up his U.S. ties. Canada-U.S. relations are in immediate need of fixing up after the Liberals' time in office. A meeting between Harper and George Bush is in the works, though no date or location has been set. Wilson's confident that Canada and U.S. are on the way to putting relations back on a better, friendlier footing. Isn't that nice? We have to keep George Bush happy, I guess. I believe the tone from the top is absolutely critical. The Prime Minister and President know each other. They've met on a few occasions. Now, this is Harper and Bush. They've talked on the phone. They'll be getting together fairly soon, Wilson expects. He acknowledges that not all Canadians would be happier with cozier relationships, and that he will also have to remind Americans occasionally the U.S. is not universally beloved in Canada. It is not that we are anti-American. It is A, we're pro-Canadian. Secondly, we don't have to be anti-American to stand against the free trade and NAFTA agreement. These agreements haven't had anything to do with Canada and the U.S. as countries. They've had everything to do with the passage of corporate power into these companies who don't want to see the borders anymore, who want to see a total big plain block so they can freely move their goods and services and people throughout the three countries of Mexico, Canada, and the States. Are you prepared to compete with a Mexican worker who is only used to making $2 a day? You may have to, very shortly. Wilson said he and Harper intend to use good relationships that former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney has with the current administration, with George Bush. Mulroney's a good friend of George Bush Sr. and has many friends and associates in U.S. conservative corridors. Yes, he does. He's the corporate go-between between the U.S. and Canada. So Wilson fixed it up for us, and he got Canada back on the good track with George Bush. So Harper's most important relationship is with George Bush and his buddy Steve when they met to talk about the integration of our two countries with the SPP. Free trade, NAFTA, and the North American Union with the USA. We've got George Bush Sr. with George Bush Jr. holding his puppet strings. We've got Bush and Harper, Bush and Vincente Fox and Harper, Bush and Bush and Harper and Brian Mulroney and Harper. And of course, the King of Canada. Nice picture, eh? The 4 steps now to this North American Union, to put it together. The first step is towards the North American Union is NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. So they've got that accomplished already. They've pushed us into NAFTA. The one thing that the Canadian Action Party that we stand against is the NAFTA agreement. We believe that that agreement has to be abrogated because it is that agreement that gives them the power that they need to do this to us. So if we abrogate the agreement, we will be able to go back to the original GATT trading rules, which was fairer to us, also taking away their power. Can it be done? Can we get out of NAFTA? Absolutely we can. We have a 6-month cancellation clause built into NAFTA, and all we have to do is let the U.S. know that we intend to put in for this 6-month cancellation clause. The second formal step was the integration of Canada's military into the U.S. military command under NORAD, NORTHCOM, and the Binational Planning Agreement. Binational Planning Agreement came into 2002. Harper expanded us further into NORAD and NORTHCOM after he came to power. So he started talking to them in 2003-04. He brought it in 2006. The third formal step in the creation of the North American Union was the implementation of the respective liberty-stripping anti-terrorist legislations. Ever since the day of 9/11 in the U.S., we have watched as our American neighbors have been losing their rights and freedoms very clearly. Sadly, Canada has been paralleling all of those different anti-terrorist legislations. So the Patriot Act in the USA, we have a very comparable act, both under C-42 and C-36 here in Canada, that also put us under our rights and freedoms being stripped away from us, and can also put us into a mechanism to implement a police state as well. The fourth and formal step is the Security and Prosperity Partnership. They need this agreement. That agreement is a hostile takeover of the executive branch of government, a coup d'etat over the government operations of Canada, US, and Mexico by the corporate elite, by these corporate CEOs. Military integration. NORTHCOM's aerial of reconnaissance includes air, land, and sea approaches and encompasses the entire continental US, Alaska, Canada, Mexico, and the surrounding water out to approximately 500 nautical miles. So under NORTHCOM, which is out of an Air Force base in Colorado, we are now part of Northern Command, which is operated from the USA by a US leader, telling us now that they have total control over our air, land, and sea. The commander of NORTHCOM is responsible for theater security cooperation with Canada and Mexico, and it consolidates under a single unified command. Existing missions that were previously executed by the Department of Defense organizations, this provides unity of command, which is critical to mission accomplishment. NORTHCOM's headquarters are at Peterson Air Force Base, Colorado Springs, Colorado. Tories quietly expand NORAD. Stephen Harper's government has quietly committed Canada to indefinite participation in NORAD and agreed to give the military alliance new responsibilities to watch for a terror attack by sea. So fresh off his softwood lumber truce, Harper's government yesterday gave another boost to Canada-US relations when it signed off on the renewal of a landmark North American Aerospace Defense Command Treaty. Defense Minister Gordon O'Connor and David Wilkins, the U.S. Ambassador to Canada, signed the new pact at a ceremony in Ottawa, according to Janelle, a spokesperson with the U.S. State Department. Yet in Ottawa, officials within the Harper government tried to keep word of this renewal under wraps, so there was no media notification of this major signing ceremony, where they signed us into expanding us into NORAD indefinitely. So the media did not cover this signing ceremony. After persistent questioning, it was defense officials finally acknowledged that the two nations had brokered a new defense agreement. The text of the renewed NORAD agreement was signed in Ottawa April 28th by the Minister of National Defense and the U.S. Ambassador, which signals the end of the negotiating process. The new agreement expands NORAD's missions by adding maritime warning to NORAD's aerospace defense mission. This will be the first joint Canada-U.S. defense agency, which in the past has only been responsible for guarding the skies over North America. Unlike the current agreement, which will expire May 12th, this new deal will run indefinitely, acknowledging the mature nature of the U.S.-Canada defense partnership. Well, truly, folks, we're being merged, our military is being merged with the U.S. As you can see already, many of our Canadian troops are overseas fighting for the USA. More and more American intelligence agencies are setting up offices here in Canada, both the Drug Enforcement Agency, the FBI. Their border controls are taking over controls of our Canadian border guards, etc. So this is a total expansion of our military in with them, and this was done on the quiet. The NORAD agreement, which was originally signed in 1996, revisited in 2000, was amended in 2004 to now give it the task of missile tracking and warning as part of the controversial U.S. Missile Defense Shield and program. So all of those people who felt that we were opposing joining George Bush's missile defense system thought we had won. We really did. We thought we had convinced our government that we didn't want to be a part of the missile defense system. And Cretton backed out of it as well. Well, we have become a part of it under the expanded NORAD agreement. In a decision that chilled Canada-U.S. relations, Paul Martin announced February 2005 that Canada would not take part in missile defense. This is why they had to renew this agreement in quiet, because they knew that people would be opposed to Canada becoming part of the U.S. missile defense system. So this new deal means NORAD will still track incoming missiles for the U.S. defense program, but said it doesn't mean the controversial question of Canada's involvement will be reopened. There's no need to reopen the negotiations now. It's a done deal on us. Canada's decision is not affected by this agreement, and the U.S. is not seeking Canada participation in the missile defense program. they don't need us anymore. They don't need to because they've already signed us into this expansion agreement. So while the Conservatives are sure to trump with the deal as yet further proof of improving the relationships with the U.S., negotiations for the renewal were largely completed before they took office in February. Okay, so that line again, even though the Conservatives are saying this is great, it furthers our relationships and improves our relationships with the U.S., all of these NORAD agreements were negotiated and a done deal before Harper even came to power in that election. Earlier, U.S. officials had said that Harper's government was prepared to allow only a debate on the treaty, but no vote. And that would have broken a Conservative campaign pledge to let the Commons ratify international treaties. Well, they signed us into it without a vote, without debate, and without participation. Continental integration by stealth. So as Ottawa prepares to renew the NORAD agreement, a binational panel suggests nothing less than the complete integration of Canada's military, security, and foreign policy into the decision-making and operating systems of the USA. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not so thrilled with the U.S. foreign policies these days. And I think it's very crucial as a country to remain a sovereign, independent entity than being dragged into these foreign policies of a leader who is presently one of the most disliked leaders around the world. It seemed harmless at first, two mid-level Canadian Forces officers and a mild-mannered, bespectacled American consultant explaining the work of their 48-member binational planning group to audiences across Canada. Let's go to the second paragraph. A close reading of their final report reveals that their actual intent, or at least the intent of the politicians who set their mandate, is far from benign. They seek nothing less than the complete integration of Canada's military, security, and foreign policy into the U.S. Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin is the U.S.'s largest defense contractor. Paul Martin gave Lockheed Martin a Canadian contract to conduct a Canadian census back in 2006. This will now give the USA pertinent and private information on all Canadians. So there was quite an uprising even across Canada. There's a lot of Canadians that refused to answer the census, etc. Lockheed Martin, under the Homeland Security laws now of the USA, Lockheed Martin has to share all of this information with the Homeland Security Agency of the USA. It's no different than gun control. Remember when C-68 first came in a number of years ago? They were talking about it mostly focusing around just the registration of firearms. Most people don't realize that that bill had a lot more to do than just simple registration of firearms. It actually took away 4 fundamental rights and freedoms that Canadians have been used to for a number of years. Under the gun control registration, how many of you are aware that once they developed the registry and had registered all law-abiding Canadian gun owners and what you had, they passed that information over to the U.S. Homeland Security? How many of you are aware of that? National Security Agency of the U.S. Foreign policy is now tied to security. So to the federal government, nothing's more important than Canada's economic relationship with the U.S. Really. Our foreign policy, including our decision to fight in Afghanistan, is designed to keep the borders open at Windsor and Fort Erie. Isn't that nice? We don't want to take them off, and we don't want to close the borders to them because they want to do business in Canada and buy more companies up and resources up. So we have to now abide by their foreign policy. And their foreign policy is they want more and more of our Canadian troops to go fight their wars for them. They're too busy fighting their own wars. They need us to be dragged into it now as well. So Ottawa's instituting a controversial no-fly list this week, less to protect Canada than to convince Washington that we're on side with their war against terror. The no-fly list has come out. There's approximately, I think they've estimated 1,800 people on the no-fly list who are now fighting the government, fighting the system, saying, why is my name on this list? So my name is John Smith. That doesn't mean I'm a terrorist from blah, blah, blah. So now they have to fight it directly to even try and get their name off of that list. But it keeps the U.S. happy, and that's what it's all about, apparently. The ethics promise. This is how this was all done by the Harper government. So the ethics promise. This is a promise made by Prime Minister Harper during the election. He promised the Canadian people he would lead by example. In his Federal Accountability Act, he went so far as to promise he will prevent the Prime Minister from overruling the Ethics Commissioner on whether the Prime Minister or an official is in violation of the Conflict of Interest Code. And that sounded really good. And that was a major election promise. But now Mr. Harper has admitted he's even gone so far as to try and have Dr. Shapiro released. Dr. Shapiro is our ethics commissioner, showing utter contempt for the parliamentary process by trying to unilaterally remove a duly appointed officer of Parliament, an officer seeking to carry his duties out under the law. The reason why he wanted to get rid of him is he felt he broke his ethics promise. This is Democracy Watch. They filed a complaint with Ethics Commissioner Bernard Shapiro against Prime Minister Stephen Harper, John Baird, and Harper's Director of Communications. The group's letter of complaint also repeats its calls for Ethics Commissioner Shapiro to resign for failing to vigorously enforce the rules. There were 2 ethics commissioners that were dragged into this. That's why one is resigned and one is now on. Prime Minister Harper has broken promises that guaranteed a clean-up of the federal government and effective measures to ensure that public officials act honestly, ethically, openly, and prevent waste. It's business as usual in Ottawa, is what it is. So PM now attacks the ethics chief. So anger follows the launch of a preliminary probe of Harper, Emerson, and over Emerson's move when he walked across the floor from the Liberals to the Conservatives. Many people in his constituency were totally outraged, and rightfully so. They had just voted him in as a Liberal MP. So for him to get into Ottawa and immediately cross the floor, even before he sat for them and represented them, was a slap to their face. In a letter made public yesterday, Bernard Shapiro said he has decided to embark on a preliminary investigation into whether Harper compiled his conflict of interest code for MPs when he brought Emerson, who had just been re-elected as a Liberal, into the Tory fold. Yes, it is against the ethics. This is why he started a public inquiry. And then what does Harper do? He attacks the ethics commissioner and makes sure he resigns. Isn't that nice? Gets him out of the way. Patronage. Rival MPs attack the Conservative flip-flop. Liberals and Bloc slam patronage appointments. This is another area that the Conservatives used in their 2006 election campaign, saying that the Liberals were just as bad as the former Mulroney Conservatives over patronage appointments. Well, once Harper gets to power, this is what happens. Liberal and Bloc Quebecois critics slammed the patronage appointments by Prime Minister Stephen Harper. They attacked his nomination last week to the Public Appointments Commission of Gwen Morgan, a former oil company executive and a prominent Conservative Party fundraiser. So that's how he was able to be appointed as the Appointments Commissioner. And the appointment of former Jim Gook to one of the government's positions on Navigation Canada's Board of Directors. Harper defended Morgan's appointment and fired back. So it's no surprise that a CEO, frankly, any citizen in this country, wants government to be cleaned up. Well, if the CEOs really wanted the government to be cleaned up, they wouldn't become party to all of this. They wouldn't allow themselves to be appointed into specific positions. Harper adopts cautious style of patronage, so he mixes eminent names with Tory faithful. And yet again, this is what happens. The appointment of retired Deloitte Touche, former Conservative Party fundraiser as well. He has done over 840 appointments so far since he got in as our Prime Minister in 2006. Over 800 appointments. And we're talking putting Conservatives to the head of now the Atomic Energy. Now he's got rid of the Nuclear Safety Commissioner. He's going to be appointing a Conservative fundraiser. He's been appointing them on all the different boards, Crown corporations, anything that will assist him in furthering his agenda. So elected Senate. Oh, this was another major federal election of the Conservative Party in 2006, was he campaigned for an elected Senate. He was tired of the Liberals appointing their hackies to the Senate, and it's called our what is it, chair of sober second thought or something like that, level of sober second thought for senators. As soon as he gets into power, this is what he does. His first act as Prime Minister, Harper appoints his campaign co-chair as a senator and a Minister of Public Works. This guy didn't even run in the election. He didn't even run. But he was appointed as one of our senators now and the Minister of Public Works. So he is responsible now for handing out hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars in contracts to boards that they put other Conservatives on. Isn't that interesting? So because Mr. Fortier is not elected, he cannot be held accountable for his actions in the House of Commons. So, more broken promises. The freedom of information. This is another major platform that the Harper government stood on in 2006. They said it was very difficult to get information from the federal government under the Liberal Party. So what they do? It's taken in excess of a year for some Canadians to obtain government documents now, because he's put in so many different levels of people that the permission now has to go through, that people are now seeing a 240-day extension. So if you want to go find out right now what Harper talked about on your behalf with the 10 top corporate players at the Montebello meeting last August, it's going to take you about a year to find out. And when you do get it, most of it's going to be blacked out for national security purposes. So accountability. Good old Gordon O'Connor here. Stephen Harper stood on accountability in his election promises too. Stephen Harper unveiled his party's Accountability Act, which aims to crack down on the revolving door between ministers' offices, the senior public service, and the lobbying industry. Ha ha ha. The Accountability Act did not stop Gordon O'Connor from being in the crucial portfolio of our Minister of Defense. Minister O'Connor is a former lobbyist to the defense industry and is now responsible for overseeing some of the largest defense contracts in Canadian history. I mean, now Peter MacKay is, but this is his first position under the Harper government. So he's defense minister, but coincidentally, he also happened to be a lobbyist for 5 large defense contractors. So now he's overseeing all the contracts to go to these defense contractors. So, Prime Minister Harper has appointed 3 former lobbyists to cabinet: Gordon O'Connor, Lawrence Cannon, and Jean-Pierre Blackburn. Several staffers, including Sandra Buckler, which is the Prime Minister's Communications Director, along with the Chiefs of Staff to Minister of Natural Resources and Minister of Environment, and the Government House Leader, are all recently registered as federal lobbyists. Yet, they get paid by you, the taxpayer, in Ottawa right now, holding their positions for these ministers, yet they're lobbyists for companies outside of the Parliament. So not only do these actions appear to contravene the Lobbyist Registration Act, as well as the 2006 Conflict of Interest and Post-Employment Code for public official holders, it also violates the proposed Federal Accountability Act, the very cornerstone of their election platform that they had promised. Again, lobbying politicians. Harper Government broke its election promise yesterday to require ministers to record their contacts with lobbyists. So now, before, when he was running in the election, he said he's going to have every lobbyist record who they see, what they talk about, how much money is exchanged, etc. Well, now that they've drafted those regulations for it, they've kind of watered it down a little bit. Regulations have more loopholes than the rules in them. In the 2006 election campaign, Conservative Party platform pledged a new law to require all ministers and senior government officials to record their contacts with lobbyists. To this date, that has not been put into power yet. The main reason is because they need to have those connections between the large corporate players and the parliamentary officials. Conservatives vowed at the time to prevent lobbyists from obtaining payments, and new regulations requiring lobbyists to certify they're not receiving success fees. Well, that's how they do business in Ottawa, is they bring you in as a lobbyist and bring you in as a minister, then you go back to being a lobbyist. So sadly, that's another broken promise. Top Tory organizers are actually challenging the lobby rules. Because they're saying, well, wait a minute, I know you promised to make it stricter, but if you make it stricter, we're not going to be able to be on board. So we want you to water it down. So now they're complaining and they're challenging the actual lobby rules. So Derek Burney, who was a free trade negotiator, former ambassador to Mulroney, is unhappy about Harper's decision to prevent transition team from lobbying the government. So never worry, Derek Burney was just part of this new Afghanistan panel. Remember the independent, non-political, non-biased panel made up of 4 former Mulroney Conservatives and John Manley as well from the Liberal Party? Former Stephen Harper insiders, including Derek Burney, powerful former civil servant who led the government changeover, are challenging an order from the Prime Minister's office that retroactively forbids the transition team from lobbying for the next 5 years. Well, as you know already, Derek Burney is now very much a part of the Harper lobbying team. Accountability to Canadians. Conservative government announced cuts this week that may appeal to their socially conservative friends, but they've hurt so many others, including women and Aboriginals. This is the total accountability to Canadians, making sure that everyone was listened to and looked after. So what does he do with women's groups? Prime Minister cut 39% of the operating budget for the status of women. And he cut the court challenges program. So people who do not have money to have a challenge in court, sadly, have no more say in a court of law. Unless it's an actual criminal case, you're not going to get a lawyer anymore. So it's very difficult for people. You have to go extremely into debt if you want to go and challenge anything, especially a human rights issue. The Kelowna Accord was signed by federal, provincial, and native leaders just before the election call in 2005 that brought Harper's Conservative governments to power. So what do the Tories do when they get into power? Well, they decide to ignore the Parliament's Kelowna Accord vote. And Parliament has voted to resurrect a $5.1 billion program for First Nations health, education, and housing, but the minority Conservative government will ignore the measure. So to this day, they have done nothing to deal with this. A better environment. Well, as you know, you can have scientists on both sides of the border. You can have scientists that exclaim that what's causing global warming right now is just strictly man-made indicators. You have scientists on the other side of the board that say, wait a minute, the military-industrial complex is playing a very huge factor in all of our pollution. The military-industrial complex in itself, just manufacturing military equipment, causes your depleted uranium, causes all types of chemicals to be put into the system. But they don't want to go against those companies and force them to reduce their pollution because it's going to affect business. And under NAFTA, they could actually sue us if we decided to go after them to do that. So what does he do? The U.S. tells us that we now have to expand fivefold in our Alberta oil sands. Because what's happening is now that George Bush has upset many of the Middle Eastern countries over oil, he has decided that he wants to go for a sure thing, which is Canada's resources. So he has decided that Canada is now part of the USA. Our resources are part that he can use when he wants. Our water is there for him to use when he wants. So now he is told, the Harper officials, U.S. and Canadian oil executives and government officials met for a 2-day oil summit in Houston in January 2006. Same month Harper came to power, and has now made plans for a 5-fold expansion into the oil sands production in a short time span. What's happening now is the largest polluter in Canada for carbon monoxide is the oil sands. They're the largest polluter. They do more than 33% just in that one little sector for Alberta. And now, because the U.S. has told us, we now have to expand those tar sands by 5 because they want access to our oil and gas. And in turn, we sadly have to import more for our use. So, and again, Harper's alone on climate change at the Commonwealth Summit. So Prime Minister Stephen Harper is facing heavy political pressure to agree to binding targets for greenhouse gas emissions as Commonwealth Summit delegates in Uganda attempt to form a strong united front in the fight against climate change. Other than Australia, whose leader was not at the summit, Canada is now the only member of the 53-nation group that has not fallen in line with the wording on climate change resolution calling for binding targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that could cause global warming. He can't. He can't because now he's so connected to the corporate elite of Canada and the USA that he will stand in the way of their business. Okay, as for Afghanistan, our soldiers are now dying in Afghanistan. To date, 78 Canadian soldiers and 1 diplomat have died. And our soldiers are being put into combat on the front line in Kandahar. It's the most dangerous place of all of Afghanistan. If you've read the recent reports about NATO, NATO does not believe it's winning the war in Afghanistan. NATO also states that the southern provinces where the Canadian soldiers are the most volatile, dangerous area of Afghanistan to be in. But you have to wonder about something. The U.S. went into Afghanistan shortly after September 11th in 2001, right? They've been in Afghanistan since 2001, so 7 years now. So how could it be when you have such control over a country, such control over the borders of that country, and the airways, and the railways, and the roadways, that Afghanistan now stands to be the largest supplier of opium in the world? What a coincidence, eh? For the 2nd year running, no less. So you can't tell me that they've been able to take poppies out of Afghanistan without the knowledge of the U.S. and UK military. They would have to know. And especially when you're putting out enough to become the largest supplier in the world, right? So really and truly, are our soldiers there to help spread democracy for the people of Afghanistan? When you go and talk to the people of Afghanistan, they don't feel that way. I mean, they're happy that Canada's there and protecting them from some warlords. But that's who our soldiers are fighting. They're not fighting the Taliban, they're now fighting the drug warlords. So this is a very dangerous place for our soldiers to be in. The Angus Reid poll says Canadians want to end the Afghan mission. Do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Canada should withdraw its troops from Afghanistan before their mandate ends in February 2009. 50% said yes, 18% not sure, and 32% disagree. Now, as you are well aware, Harper is trying to expand this mission now to 2011. If we allow him to do this, and of course all of a sudden the Liberals are coming on side, and the Liberals and Conservatives are working together to potentially come to an agreement that yes, we could go to 2011, but after that time we really should just be training the troops instead. Well, the difficulty is, it's bad enough that we have to wait to 2009 to remove our troops from this danger. If we allow it to go to 2011, what happens before then? Before 2011? Yes, in 2010. That's right. So if we now have the three countries merged in 2010, one whole year before 2011, this is why Harper says it's indefinite. This is why he doesn't want to give an end date. Because once we've merged with the U.S., our soldiers sadly are going to be there for decades to come. NATO experts are saying now it could take as many as 5 decades to put Afghanistan right again. Are we really willing to have our soldiers there for the next 50 years under the U.S.? I don't think so. Canadians oppose Tories in both Kyoto and Afghanistan. This is yet another one. Conservative government has the support of just 4 out of 10 Canadians for its decision to extend the military mission. But what Harper did, he's a smart businessman. So what he did is he said, okay, I know the majority of Canadians don't want our soldiers there, so I'll tell you what. NATO now has to come up with 1,000 more troops and more equipment to help us, the unmanned aerial vehicles to monitor the borders, etc. And only then will we consider extending the time period that our soldiers are in Afghanistan. Well, guess what? From day one, even before he started to make this as a potential part of the agreement, it had already been decided that our soldiers were going to continue to be there. They had already decided NATO's going to give 1,000 troops. That's nothing. There's only 37,000 troops in Afghanistan to begin with. And there's only 2,500 of them are Canadian. There's a few hundred Brits, and the rest are American. So are we really there as a NATO, as a number of different countries? No, not at all. Angus Reid, Canadians reject extending the Afghan mission. These are 3 different polls to date. So what's happening is our leaders are not listening to us. They've already made deals ahead of us. And sadly, we're not being heard, even though poll after poll is telling that the majority of Canadians do not want our soldiers in Afghanistan any longer. At least 738 soldiers, including 73 Canadians, have died in the war on terrorism, either in support of the U.S.-led Operation Enduring Freedom or as part of the International Security Assistance Force led by NATO. In May of 2006, the House of Commons extended Canada's mission in Afghanistan to February 2009. That was only 4 months after Harper came to power. In 2006, he made it extended. And now again, that's why he wants to extend it to 2011, because by then it will be too late to change it. Canadian lawmakers have written an Afghanistan version of the Iraq Study Report, reaching a conclusion that the conditions on the original battlefront in the war on terror are grave and deteriorating. So it's not getting better there. The 16-page Canadian Senate report entitled Taking a Hard Look at the Hard Mission foresees a conflict that could drag on for generations and might well fail unless NATO significantly increases its commitment of money and troops. So that's the only thing that Harper's saying now. We'll support an extension for 2011, providing NATO coughs up 1,000 troops. Easy to do. Easy to do for NATO. This will happen. And then Harper will say, see, they were listening to us. Therefore, this extra 1,000 troops, we need to keep our Canadian military in there. Tories accused of lying about Afghanistan. What a surprise. So 10 more years of Afghan security. Conservative government was accused today of painting a misleading, rosy portrait of the situation in Afghanistan that contradicts the view of its own military experts. The Tories say Afghanistan should be stable enough to handle its own security by 2011. Really? A view reiterated late Thursday by the spokeswoman for Prime Minister Harper. General Rick Hellier declared it will probably take 10 years or so for the Afghan army to meet its own security demands. That puts it way beyond the merging and the integration of our three countries. It's time to let the Conservative government know we want our soldiers home. 99% of Canadian troops want our soldiers home, and 100% want Harper sent to Afghanistan. And support our troops. Bring them home now. Okay, Louise Arbour, the United Nations Commissioner on Human Rights, has now attacked Harper on human rights as well. Louise Arbour, the Canadian who leads the UN on human rights, attacked the Harper government today for failing to maintain Canada's stature as a champion for individual rights and freedoms in the world. We are losing, sadly, our position as a peacekeeper, as a human rights, as a leading light for human rights around the world. Canada was always looked after as one of those countries that would be able to lead the way, and sadly, it's not happening anymore. Canada has to work very hard to maintain what historically has been the perception internationally that it's a consensus builder and it's a valid interlocutor for all, Arbour said. Earlier, she told audience of rights advocates that were profoundly disappointed by a recent decision by the Harper government not to join other nations in approving a UN declaration upholding the human, land, and resource rights of the world's native people. So, he doesn't want to help. Anti-terrorism powers. Conservative governments launching a bid to recover controversial anti-terrorism powers as early as this fall. That was 2007. Revive the wedge issue that could force the Liberals into another internal debate. So the Anti-Terrorism Act, passed in 2001, bestowed extraordinary powers upon government agents in an attempt to help them thwart terrorist plots. This is the legislation that's allowing the FBI and DEA and CIA to come into Canada and monitor you and follow you and make sure you're not considered a terrorist threat to the USA. Because these measures treaded on conventional civil liberties, a built-in sunset clause meant that Parliament periodically had to vote to renew them. So the Supreme Court gave Ottawa a year to replace the existing law, which it deemed unconstitutional. Well, as I'm sure you're all aware, Harper just reactivated the anti-terrorism powers within the last 2 weeks in Parliament without the consideration of it being unconstitutional. So, fingerprinting, it's not just for criminals anymore. So now that we're at war, this is from a message from Homeland Security, so now we're at war, terrorists far and wide have attacked us. So now we need your fingerprints, your phone records, your credit card bills, your magazine subscriptions, your email, utility bills, and much, much more. Just to keep us safe, we need to monitor you. So anti-war crusader rips into Harper. Stephen Harper's turning Canada away from its history of sheltering U.S. war objectors and is pushing the country to become more like America. This is an anti-war mother whose son was killed in Iraq. This is Cindy Sheehan, who went to Texas, Bush's place in Texas, and exposed Bush's part of the whole Iraq war, the lies behind the Iraq war, the lies that brought the U.S. into war against Iraq and Afghanistan, and pretty soon Iran by the sounds of it. So Cindy Sheehan is quite concerned that Harper is following Bush's policy. Sheehan told audience members to follow her example by camping outside Sussex Drive and asking Harper why he supports Bush's policies. Your government has been taken over by a neoconservative, a carbon copy of the Bush administration. And sadly, it has. Now, I'm a member of the War Resisters group here in Canada, and Canada, again, was always a country in the world that people were very proud of when they felt that they could not clearly align themselves with the war in the Vietnam. They came here. We opened our country to them. They've become part of our society. And now, sadly, we have to watch as we return people again and again to the U.S. to face prosecution or more, even court-martialing, because they refuse to fight in an illegal war. Well, part of their laws in the U.S. is actually states that the soldiers have a right and responsibility to refuse to be part of an illegal war. And this is what they've used in order to come to Canada. The sad fact is the Harper government says, so what? Doesn't matter if it was illegal or not. You were ordered, you have to proceed with it. So, this is just a picture of a NAFTA superhighway. They're saying it's going to be 10 football fields wide. Now, What our leaders have said in Montebello was there was no such thing happening. That it was just a conspiracy theory about this Trans-Texas corridor. All you have to do is tap in Trans-Texas corridor into a Google, and you can see how much the people of Texas and Oklahoma are standing up to fight this non-existent Trans-Texas corridor that's going through their property. Their property is being taken away from them. Their family farms that they've had for generations are being usurped in order to build these highways. Well, the state of Oklahoma has decided to put a kink in this, because the entire state of Oklahoma has voted no, that they do not want to be part of this Trans-Texas corridor, NASCO corridor. Security and Prosperity Partnership meeting. This particular meeting was in August of last year at Chateau Montebello. He's going to meet with Bush and Philip Calderon Montebello August 20th, 21st. It's an executive level pact between the government and corporate sectors of Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, which has never been debated publicly or voted on in any of our three countries. Never. As a matter of fact, to this date, you'll still find some conservative MPs saying, North American Union, that doesn't exist. That's just a conspiracy theory. Well, for something that's just a conspiracy theory, they're certainly having lots of meetings on it. They've had meetings in Banff, Alberta, Ottawa, Ontario, Cancun, Waco, Texas, Cancun, Mexico, and now Montebello and Ottawa, and this coming year in April in New Orleans, Louisiana. There are over 300 initiatives in the FPP that's aimed at harmonizing North American policies on food, drugs, security, immigration, refugees, manufacturing, the environment, and public health. So every sector has to be harmonized with the standards and rules and regulations of the other two countries. And that's occurring right now on a regular basis in meetings. The Binational Planning Group, again, is part of the SPP initiative. The SPP is closely related to it. Independent task force sponsored by the American Council on Foreign Relations calls for the transformation of NORAD into a multi-service defense command. The CFR document entitled North American Community, drafted on behalf of the SPP, endorses the Binational Planning Group in March of 2006. Their recommendations are, as recommended in a report of the Canada-U.S. Joint Planning Group, NORAD should evolve into a multi-service defense command that would expand the principle of Canadian-U.S. Joint Command to land and naval, as well as air forces, engaged in defending the approaches to North America. In addition, Canada and the U.S. should reinforce other bilateral defense institutions, including the Permanent Joint Border Defense Joint Planning Group, and invite Mexico to send observers. So they are doing their best to merge this. This was actually a North American Community report put out by the Council on Foreign Relations and our Canadian Council of Chief Executives, and no doubt with the help of Brian Mulroney. So they are now calling a trinational call for a North American economic and security community by 2010. That's just 2 years. 3 former high-ranking government officials from Canada, Mexico, and U.S. are calling for a North American economic security community by 2010 to address shared security threats, challenges to competitiveness, and interest in broad-based development across all 3 countries. The Canadian Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, John Manley, was one of those 3 players. This is the same John Manley that was Prime Minister at one time under the Liberal government, has now participated with Harper under the Afghanistan panel, also has been very influential with the merger agreement under Security and Prosperity Partnership. He sat on the actual task force that was put the 3 countries together with representatives. He sat on the task force to bring forward the Security and Prosperity Partnership Agreement. Prime Minister Harper concludes the leaders' meetings in Cancun. He expressed his satisfaction with the outcome of his visit to Cancun, Mexico, where he met George Bush and Mexican President Vicente Fox. The 3 leaders took the opportunity to discuss trilateral Canada-U.S.-Mexico cooperation, with particular attention paid to shared security, prosperity, and quality of life. Doesn't that sound wonderful? We're going to have a better quality of life. Objectives on the Security and Prosperity Partnership of North America, they reviewed progress on the implementation of the SPP and reaffirmed their commitment to advancing a positive agenda for the continent. So they are proceeding, whether you like it or not. They're putting people in positions of power to further this goal. But you know what? This is not unbeatable. Not by a long shot. Security and Prosperity Partnership of North America, the next steps.
This is off Harper's official website himself. So the three leaders in North America agreed to advance the agenda of the SPP of North America by focusing on 5 high priority initiatives. The first one is the North American Competitiveness Council. The NACC, or North American Competitiveness Council, is made up of 30 members to represent all of North America. These 30 members are 10 from Canada, 10 from the US, and 10 from Mexico. These members were the only ones that were allowed into the Montebello meeting last August to report and meet with the 3 leaders from the 3 countries in the SPP negotiations. The next one is advancing cooperation on avian and pandemic influenza. As a matter of fact, under Bush's laws in the US, pandemic influenza is considered an emergency threat, which will bring in martial law. So we have to join them with their particular martial law and police state tactics. North American Energy Security Initiative. This would ensure that the state continues to achieve and gather all of its energy security that it will need for the next 20 years. The North American Emergency Management. They are now merging our emergency management. So what they've predicted, they say a satellite has now died. May fall to the Earth, may fall in North America, may fall in Canada. But we should be happy to know that if it happens to fall in Canada, George Bush has already promised us that he'll come here and help us. Isn't that wonderful? He'll send his military to come and assist us if it happens to hit in the Canada. And last but not least, smart, secure borders. Mel Hurtig, concerns in the SPP and NAU. Mel Hurtig is an author, founder of the Council of Canadians, and former leader of the National Party of Canada. He obtained internal documents about the September 12-14 forum, which was in Banff, revealing the gathering was called the Continental Prosperity in the New Security Environment. That was back in 2006. Mel says, we're talking about such an important thing. We're talking about the integration of Canada, the US, and Mexico. So for them to hold a meeting in secret and to make every effort to avoid anybody learning about it right away, you've got to be hugely concerned, Hurtig said. Hurtig says questions should be raised in the House of Commons about why Canadians are being kept in the dark on the meetings attended by officials like Stockwell Day. Minister of Public Safety, Stockwell Day, Defense Minister Gordon O'Connor attended a meeting September 12th to 14th of cabinet ministers, 5-star generals, and corporate elite in Banff, Alberta to discuss the North American integration. The public was not invited. So when we say, hey, we're tired of you having secret meetings, we really should have a say in what's happening to us, we're told, well, we're not really doing anything. You're just a conspiracy theorist. You know, don't worry. We're looking after your best interests. The topics of this particular meeting in Banff were a vision for North America, a North American energy strategy, demographic and social dimensions of North American integration, and opportunities for security cooperation. So it's very, very clear that these businessmen and their 5-star generals and their cabinet ministers in Ottawa are talking about the integration of North America. It's very clear. In attendance, Special Advisor to the Chief of Defense Staff, Canadian manufacturers and exporters, Canadian Council of Chief Executives, Mr. Tom DeQuino was at that meeting, you can rest assured, Stockwell Day, Dr. Wendy Dobson, Institute for International Business. Wendy Dobson happens to be a member also of the Trilateral Commission. For those of you that don't know, the Trilateral Commission is the corporate lobbyist group that looks after Canada and the US. And in the States, it's Council on Foreign Relations. In Europe, it's the Bilderberg Group. So the Trilateral is a sister to the Council on Foreign Relations and operates out of Canada, and Dr. Wendy Dobson is one of the members. Mr. Ward Elcock, Deputy Minister of National Defense. Ward Elcock, too, I believe, is with CSIS. Dr. Bill Elliott, Associate Deputy Minister of Public Safety, Canadian Centre for International Governance, and, of course, Mr. Richard Green, Suncor Energy. So you have to get your oil and gas companies in there. Patty Fogel, she's our leader of the Canadian Action Party. She says the SPP is a hostile takeover of the apparatus of democratic government and an end to the rule of law. There has been a kind of coup d'etat over the government operations of Canada, US, and Mexico. The SPP is a treasonous metamorphosis of our federal and provincial government bureaucracies into formal instruments to implement the agenda of the shadow government, the military-industrial financial complex, exemplified by the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, who in turn are dominated by the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations and the U.S. military apparatus. So the entire military-industrial complex, which is the combination of your banks, your resource companies, and your military, are the ones behind this merger of the three countries, using these particular agencies. North American Union. In June of 2006, the CEO power was formalized when our government created the North American Competitiveness Council, an advisory committee comprised of reps from the largest corporations in North America, including Walmart, Chevron, General Motors, Lockheed Martin, Suncor, and others. Their goal is to make North America more competitive globally, which means weakening our government's ability to regulate any industry standards, protecting the environment, or our social safety net. Lockheed Martin's Ron Covey's statement to Maclean's magazine earlier this month about the role was quite revealing. The guidance from the ministers was, tell us what we need to do and we'll make it happen. This is what they asked at the Montebello meeting. The ministers, our Stockwell Day, Peter MacKay, Harper, told these corporate boys, tell us what to do, we'll make it happen. So, meet these 10 powerful business members of the North American Competitiveness Council. Manulife Financial, Power Corporation, Daniel Brothers, Suncor Energy, CN, Linamar Corporation, Bell Canada Enterprises, Canfor Corporation, the Home Depot, and Scotiabank. These top companies represent Canada in all of the North American Integration, Security, and Prosperity Partnership Agreements. They are there to tell our ministers what they want to see done. And in all fairness to Jim Shepherd of Canfor Corporation, this is the old Jim Shepherd. There's now a new CEO of Canfor called Jim Shepherd, but this is the first Jim Shepherd who is a member of the NACC. GOP lawmaker alleges Bush wants to merge U.S. with Mexico and Canada. So a veteran Republican lawmaker is accusing President Bush of pushing a behind-the-scenes agenda that will result in the U.S. being merged with Mexico and Canada. State Senator Karen Johnson, who's a Republican out of Mesa, says she believes the Security and Prosperity Partnership being run out of the White House and the U.S. Department of Commerce is little more than a secret plan to end U.S. sovereignty by 2010. Now this is a senator, a Republican senator saying this. And she said Congress is being kept in the dark until the point that it becomes a done deal. Just like in Parliament, where we have no discussion and no vote in Parliament, they're having no discussion and no vote in Congress as well. It's all going to be a North American community, just like a European Union, she said, with a single currency, just like the euro. We'll have no sovereignty, we'll have no constitution left. She was first elected to the legislature back in '96, and she said, it will make moot all of the other arguments that tend to divide the nation, like abortion, gay rights. We're not going to be able to argue those rights anymore because we're going to be ruled by unelected tribunals and bureaucrats that are unelected. So all of these CEOs who are unelected. However, we've got some help in the USA. There are 19 American states who have pushed resolutions, House resolutions into Congress, into the state, who are opposing the Security and Prosperity Partnership of North America, the NAFTA Superhighway, and the developing of a North American Union. Alabama, Arizona, Colorado, Georgia, Hawaii, Idaho, Illinois, Missouri, Montana, Oklahoma, Oregon, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, and Virginia. All of those states are opposing the SPP on their state level. That's equivalent to 19 Canadian provinces, for heaven's sakes. This is massive, massive opposition happening in the U.S. But are you hearing about it? Not unless you tap into some of their particular websites. And last but not least, Republican Representative Virgil Good has put forward a House Congressional Resolution 40, and in it he's saying he's expressing the sense of Congress that the United States should not engage in the construction of a North American Free Trade Agreement superhighway system or enter into a North American Union with Mexico and Canada. So this has actually gone to the House of Congress. It has not been voted on as yet. Connie and I actually sent a letter to all of the different states' people who are opposing the Security and Prosperity Partnership. And we said, we're just a little party in Canada. We want to congratulate you for taking a stand. And it was Virgil Good, actually, who responded to us. He sent us a copy of his House Resolution 40 and a letter saying, wow, is it ever good to know there's at least one party up in Canada who's standing in opposition to the SPP as well. So, House Resolution opposes North America. That's more about Virgil Good. He wants to block a NAFTA superhighway system and to indicate the opposition of the Congress to the Security and Prosperity Partnership. So every time we start talking about SPP being a North American agenda, we're being told we're crazy. It's interplanetary, right? Harper said it's interplanetary. This is what it's about. We are refusing it because we know that this is the final piece in the puzzle to bring about the North American Union. And it's got lots of opposition. So, the plan to replace the dollar with the Amero. Robert Pastor is a godfather of this North American Union agenda. And he's very influential. He's been part of the Toward the North American Community book he wrote. He's been very supportive of merging the three countries together, and he insists that it's time to create a new currency. So Toward the North American Community calls for the creation of a North American Union that would perfect the defects Pastor believes limit the progress of the European Union. Much of Pastor's thinking appears aimed at limiting the power and sovereignty of the U.S. as we enter this new super-regional entity. Pastor has also called for the creation of a new currency, which he's coined the Amero, a currency that's proposed to replace the U.S. dollar, the Canadian dollar, and the Mexican peso. Well, when we tried to bring this up publicly, we were told there's no such thing, there's no Amero coin, this is all a conspiracy theory. Well, after this meeting, for those of you who want to see the actual Amero coins, we have a complete collection of Amero coins that a gentleman from Williams Lake was able to purchase from the Denver, Colorado Mint. And they're all the Amero coins. North of border link finishes NAFTA superhighway grid. So Atlantic Pacific route would allow cross-continental good deliveries. So Canada's announced a plan to extend the NAFTA superhighway network north in a way that would finish a continental grid designed to accommodate an anticipated tsunami of containers from China and the Far East. Both SISCOR, which will do the National Transportation Route, which is designed to reach West Coast ports of Vancouver and Prince Rupert, all the way to Montreal and Halifax. So right now, although northern BC is being hit due to the downturn in the forestry industry, and there's no oil and mining or oil and gas and mining right now for them to cross-sector into, there is support at Prince Rupert, which is becoming busier than ever. It's shaving off at least 2 days of transportation time for the Orient, and they're quite delighted with it. So you're going to start to see a lot more of these corridors happening. They go right up into Manitoba. We do have some of the documents that will be in the DVD will be on the Canamex as well, which is the trade corridor for Alberta, all the way down to the USA as well. In order to do this, not only do they have to build these trade corridors, which take it right from Mexico, right up through the States, back up into Canada, but they also have to break it down into regions. And so the region of the East, which will include the Maritime provinces and the northeastern states, is called Atlantica. And the region of the West, which will encompass BC and Alberta, and merge it with California, Idaho, etc., is called Cascadia. This is a completion of these particular regions. And actually Cascadia was first named too, or brought out into the public by former Preston Manning of the Reform Party. And now, of course, Atlantica boys are meeting on a regular basis. They actually just had a meeting 2 months ago on bringing the premiers of the American different states as well as the maritime premiers together to merge Atlantica region as well. So a new 911 crisis will be the catalyst to merge U.S., Mexico, and Canada. The North American Union later says a merger is just a crisis away. So the same Robert Pastor, who's the intellectual force behind the North American community, has told the WorldNet Daily he believes a new 911 crisis could be used as the catalyst to merge the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. Because what happens right now is if there is, God forbid, if there is another terrorist attack on North American soil, will we be kept a separate entity? Sadly not. Not anymore. Not under NORAD and NORTHCOM and the police state and the anti-terrorist legislation. As a matter of fact, we will quickly fall under George Bush's police state apparatus. So this is what he's saying. In May of 2005, he was the co-chairman of Council on Foreign Relations, who produced a report called Towards the North American Community, which he claimed was the blueprint for the Security and Prosperity Partnership. So a 911 crisis made Canada and the U.S. redefine the protection of the borders. A debt crisis in Mexico forced that government to adapt to a new economic model, and the crisis obliges the governments to make difficult decisions. So what I'm saying is that is that a crisis is an event which can force democratic governments to make difficult decisions like those that will be required to create a North American community. It's not that I want to see another 9/11 crisis, but having a crisis would force decisions that otherwise might not get made. And this is what the corporate boys are worried about, because Harper is a minority government. And if we return another minority government, they may not get their way. So this is one of their big concerns. Are they going to be able to convince us through CanWest Global that Stephen Harper could have a majority government? Perhaps. But this is one other way that he foresees this happening, because otherwise the decisions necessary for the corporate elite to continue their plan and finalize it might not be able to happen. So his recommendations: create a North American Parliament, create a North American Commission, create a customs union, create a North American currency, and a standardization of our immigration and custom laws. Got it all figured out for us. So here's Stephen Harper speaking to the American corporate members of the Council on Foreign Relations. And this is the speech last September, where he said he was concerned that there was too much nationalism here in Canada. That he's just not getting his way, because people are taking a stand and saying, I don't think we like this. This isn't good for us. So we're questioning him on what he's doing. And he's telling the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations, the way it looks right now, if there was another federal election, sadly, I might be returned to another minority government. And they went, ooh, we got to change that. So the very, very next week, CanWest Global brings out a brand new poll and says, if there was an election call right now, Stephen Harper would win a majority government. And I went, where did that come from? So I've been copying polls for the last year, and you actually can have 3 different pollsters, and a lot of these pollsters are paid for by the government dollars to give you the exact results that they're looking for. So 3 different pollsters, 3 different versions of the polls. Harper went from 32 to 42% within 3 days. I thought, wow. Jump in popularity or what? Corporate takeover of Canada and North America through trade, military, business, and economy. Is the NAU in your best interest? You want a microchip? Look at our big emperor over here in the middle. Police state laws. There's the HARP system. So the biggest government conspiracy of all is the claim that there are no government conspiracies. So the Conservatives and their corporate friends have given us free trade, NAFTA, GST, missile defense, wars, a North American Union, and lots of broken promises. So deep integration is their goal. Thousands of Canadians, Americans, and Mexicans are opposed to the SPP North American Union agenda. Join us and help us to keep Canada sovereign. Canadian Action Party is a federal political party standing on guard for Canada's independence and promoting monetary, democratic, and electoral reform to restore hope for all of Canadians. And after all of these broken promises, how can you ever trust them again? To speak for you, to do business in your name, and to represent you in Parliament. So join me in being part of the change you wish to see. Yes, we can stop these men, because it's not insurmountable. You're looking at 150 businessmen, 8 politicians, and Brian Mulroney as the go-between. Are you really going to give up your country, your rights, and your freedoms to these unelected, unaccountable businessmen? I don't think so. So it's been with great pleasure that I've actually stood for a party who has stood for this many years. And you know, it's pretty sad that after 10 years, many people say, Canadian Action Party? Well, I've never heard of you. And isn't that sad? After 10 years of growing and growing, so now we have more candidates than ever coming on board. We've grown national. We have members in every province of Canada. And now we're being told, well, we can't have you at the candidate forums. We can't have you at the radio forums, because Canadian people might find out about you and might just find out that they truly do have a party that stands for the people of Canada, not the corporate elite of Canada. So please join me, and when you see an election, if you happen to, grab it fast, because otherwise, as you know, Harper has fixed the next election date to be October 2009 right now. So unless we force the federal election this spring, and this is what I want to see, because that's the only way we're going to be able to bring this out to the masses, Otherwise, by the time we get to the next federal election of October 2009, it will be too late to be able to do anything, because 2010 is just 2 months beyond that. So this is why it is crucial to all of us and to our country to see a federal election this spring. And we need all of you to understand who the players are, what their positions are, and the fact that we still, collectively, can stand and stop them from doing this to us. So we stand for a very independent, free Canada, and we hope that you stand with us. Thank you very much.